Once upon a time, in a peaceful village nestled between green hills and sparkling rivers, there lived a young girl named Cinderella. Cinderella was a kind-hearted and gentle soul. Her eyes were as blue as the sky on a sunny day, and her smile could light up even the darkest room. She lived with her father, who loved her very much. But one day, her father married a woman who had 2 daughters of her own. At first, Cinderella hoped that her stepmother and stepsisters would be her friends. She thought they would be like a new family. But soon, things changed. Cinderella's stepmother turned out to be very mean and didn't like Cinderella at all. Her stepsisters, Anastasia and Drizella, were just as mean. They were always jealous of Cinderella because she was so kind, and they were not. As time passed, Cinderella's father became very sick, and sadly, he passed away. From that moment on, Cinderella's life became very hard. Her stepmother made her do all the chores around the house. She had to clean the floors, cook the meals, wash the clothes, and even feed the animals. Every day was the same. Cinderella would wake up early in the morning, put on her old ragged dress, and work from sunrise to sunset. Her stepsisters, on the other hand, never lifted a finger. They spent their days trying on fancy dresses, brushing their hair, and looking at themselves in the mirror. They had big, fancy rooms full of pretty things, while poor Cinderella had to sleep in the cold attic on a tiny bed made of straw. But despite everything, Cinderella never complained. She remained sweet and cheerful, finding happiness in the little things like the birds that sang by her window and the mice that scurried around the attic. She even made friends with them, giving each little mouse a name. There was Gus, Jack, and a few others who kept her company when she was lonely. One day, a grand announcement came from the palace. The king and queen were throwing a royal ball for their son, the prince. Every girl in the kingdom was invited, and the prince would choose one lucky girl to be his bride. Cinderella's stepsisters were overjoyed. They spent hours getting ready, trying on dresses and fancy hats. They didn't even think about Cinderella. But Cinderella dreamed of going to the ball too. She longed to wear a beautiful gown and dance in the grand ballroom. Oh, how wonderful it would be to meet the prince, she thought. With a hopeful heart, she asked her stepmother, "May I go to the ball too?" Her stepmother laughed cruelly and said, "You? Go to the ball? Look at you. You have no nice clothes and you're much too dirty. No, you must stay home and clean." Cinderella's heart sank, but she didn't give up hope. She found an old dress that had belonged to her mother. It was beautiful, even though it was a bit old and worn. With the help of her animal friends, Cinderella worked on fixing up the dress, adding ribbons and lace. But when her stepsisters saw her dress, they were jealous. "You can't wear that!" they shouted, and they tore her dress to shreds. Cinderella was heartbroken, tears streaming down her face. "It's no use," she cried. "I'll never go to the ball." She ran out into the garden. Just then, a soft, warm light filled the garden. Cinderella looked up and saw a kind old woman standing before her. She had sparkling eyes and a gentle smile. "Don't cry, my dear," the woman said. "I am your fairy godmother, and you shall go to the ball." Cinderella wiped her tears, barely believing her ears. But how? "I have no dress, no carriage, no way to go." The fairy godmother waved her wand, and with a swish and a flick, magic sparkled all around. A nearby pumpkin turned into a gleaming golden carriage. Her little mice became beautiful white horses, and a big, friendly rat transformed into a handsome coachman. "But what about my dress?" Cinderella asked, looking down at her torn rags. "Leave that to me," said the fairy godmother. She waved her wand again, and Cinderella's rags turned into the most beautiful gown she had ever seen. It was sparkling blue with silver stars, and it shimmered in the moonlight. On her feet appeared 2 glass slippers that glittered like diamonds. Cinderella twirled in delight. "Oh, thank you, fairy godmother. Thank you." "Now go to the ball, my dear," said the fairy godmother. "But remember, you must return before the clock strikes midnight or the magic will wear off." Cinderella nodded, her heart full of joy, and climbed into the golden carriage. Off she went to the royal palace, her heart racing with excitement. At the ball, everyone turned to look when Cinderella entered the grand ballroom. She was so beautiful that no one, not even her stepsisters, recognized her. The prince, who had been greeting guests all evening, couldn't take his eyes off her. He walked straight up to her and asked, "May I have this dance?" Cinderella nodded shyly, and they began to dance. Around and around they twirled, moving gracefully across the ballroom floor. Cinderella had never been so happy. She and the prince talked and laughed all evening. It was as if they had known each other forever. As they danced, Cinderella lost track of time. She was having so much fun that she forgot the Fairy Godmother's warning. Suddenly, the clock began to chime. Dong! Dong! It was midnight. "Oh no!" Cinderella gasped. "I have to go." She pulled away from the prince and ran as fast as she could out of the palace. Down the grand staircase she fled, but in her hurry she lost one of her glass slippers. The prince called after her, but Cinderella didn't stop. She jumped into the golden carriage, and just as the clock finished its final dong, the magic ended. The carriage turned back into a pumpkin. The horses became mice again, and Cinderella was left standing in her torn rags. But she still held one glass slipper. The next day, the prince was determined to find the girl who had danced with him. He sent his royal servants to every house in the kingdom with the glass slipper. "Whoever fits this slipper," the prince declared, "will be my bride." The servants went from house to house, but no one's foot fit the slipper. Some feet were too big, some were too small, but none were just right. Finally, they came to Cinderella's house. The stepsisters tried and tried to squeeze their feet into the glass slipper, but it was no use. Then, just as the servants were about to leave, Cinderella quietly stepped forward. "May I try it on?" she asked. Her stepsisters laughed. "You? As if the prince would want you." But the royal servant nodded kindly and said, "Of course." Cinderella sat down, and as soon as she slipped her foot into the glass slipper, it fit perfectly. The stepsisters gasped in shock. At that moment, Cinderella pulled out the matching slipper from her pocket. The servant smiled and said, "You are the one the prince has been searching for." Soon, Cinderella was brought to the palace where the prince was waiting for her. When he saw her, he smiled and said, "I knew it was you." Cinderella and the prince were married in a grand celebration. She wore a beautiful wedding gown, and her heart was full of joy. The king and queen welcomed her into the royal family with open arms, and Cinderella finally had the life she deserved, filled with love, kindness, and happiness. And as for her stepsisters and stepmother, well, they had to learn the hard way that being kind and good is far more important than being rich or pretty. And so, Cinderella and the prince lived happily ever after.
Miniatures Planet.